Good morning. This is Mike Billington. I'm joined today by Chaz Freeman. Chaz is well known for his role as the interpreter for President Nixon during his groundbreaking visit to China in 1972. And then he served in several positions in both the Defense Department and the State Department, and served as the U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia during the first war with Iraq. He was also appointed director of the National Intelligence Council in 2009, but the appointment was undermined. Would you like to add anything on your career?
No, I'm just happy to be free of 30 years of service to the government and the American public, and no longer subject to the constraints of towing the official line.
Well, that you're certainly not guilty of towing the official line. So I have two areas of questions that I want to bring up. One on the war danger between Russia and the U.S. And NATO, but the other on the situation in Asia. But let me begin by a question which I didn't include in the ones I suggested to you earlier, but given the situation in the Middle East. The Schiller Institute is sponsoring a rally at the Congress on Wednesday this week, demanding no funding for Ukraine, no war on Russia. However, we have learned that the neocons are sponsoring a counter rally demanding funding for two wars. So let's begin by asking your view on the new Israeli war on Hamas and perhaps also with Iran.
Well, we are seeing a disturbing tendency in our press to invent Iranian direction of this war, that somehow Iran put Hamas up to the attacks it has carried out. I think that is completely wrong and very dangerous, because it could be used to justify an Israeli or an American attack on Iran, as indeed we have threatened for years. The fact is that Palestinians have come to the point where many of them feel they have nothing to lose. This attack was an act of desperation, and it came out of the blue. I analogize it to the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, which achieved objectives that no one had imagined. Namely, it convinced the public at large that the existing policies toward Vietnam were doomed to fail. And it ultimately produced a withdrawal from Vietnam by the United States. I think Hamas will lose decisively on the battlefield, but it may win the war, especially if Israel carries out its threat to reduce Gaza to the dimensions of Dresden in World War II. I think that genocidal act would mobilize a lot of people against Israel who've been sitting on the fence. So this is a very important moment in the history of the Middle East and in U.S. policy toward it. It's quite clear that neither Israel nor the United States have any answer to the resistance by the Palestinians to their humiliation, eviction from their homes, and the attempted erasure of their presence from their homeland.
Right. Thank you. Okay. So I read your...
Mike, I might add that unfortunately, this war in the Middle East probably greatly increases the risk of Donald Trump winning the 2024 election, because it is yet another evidence of the ineptitude of the Biden administration in foreign affairs. It will also probably increase the prospects for an end to U.S. support for Ukraine. While you may applaud the notion that the war would then end, it will end in a way that parallels the end of the war in Vietnam, where we basically encouraged a fight to the death and then walked away from it, leaving the Vietnamese to their fate. Not an act of great responsibility on our part, no accountability whatsoever for our withdrawal, as more recently there's been none for our actions in Iraq or Afghanistan. But the difference in the third decade of the 21st century is that during the Cold War, countries, allies, friends, faced a choice between the United States and the Soviet Union. And the Soviet system, with all its brutality, was so unattractive that really was no choice at all. Now the world is not organized that way. It's not bipolar. And countries do have the option of distancing themselves from Washington. They may well do so. In fact, they're already doing it, but it may be that this accelerates the process. So many political implications yet unexamined.
Did you say that you think the situation in Israel and Palestine will increase the funding for the war in Ukraine or increase the opposition to it?
The opposite. I think it will play into the partisan divisions in the United States in such a way as to increase the prospect that aid to Ukraine will end, which of course is a very real prospect given the turmoil in the Congress and Republican opposition to that aid.
Right.
Which will probably strengthen now.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. I read your presentation at Brown University last month. Excuse me. And in that, you noted that NATO no longer has any purpose based on its original creation as a buffer against the military threat from the Soviets. What do you think it'll take for NATO to disband, as the Warsaw Pact did? And for that matter, is there any reason for the EU to continue existing?
Well, I think the question that you ask gets to the question that we should all be discussing, but we aren't, and that is how to assure peace in Europe. The EU, in part, had its origins in an effort to reconcile historic enemies in Europe. That is to reconcile the French-German divide, among other things, and produce a management system for Europe in the economic realm, ultimately in the political realm, that would ensure peace, stability, and prosperity. NATO, after the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union, could have become what the Partnership for Peace promised, that is, a management device for a cooperative security system in Europe, including a relationship with Russia, which was part of that program, that would replicate the concert of Europe, which the Congress of Vienna created at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, and manage relationships, security issues in the European area in a way that would prevent a great power war. That was an option before NATO. It did not choose it. And it chose instead to renew, in effect, a kind of Cold War with a resurgent Russia. I note that Russia has not sought to reassert a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, which it gave up at the end of the Cold War with the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, as you mentioned. It has instead sought to block the expansion of an American sphere of influence to its borders in the form of Ukraine's membership in NATO, which is invariably followed, the membership in NATO is invariably followed by the forward deployment of U.S. troops and weaponry. which would simply be unacceptable to the Russians, as they've made clear. I don't think that NATO is going to disband, but the best solution for it, frankly, would be for it to be Europeanized. Europeans should be in command of their own security. The United States should backstop that, but not lead it. And I suspect that the unity of NATO, which the war in Ukraine has appeared to produce, is more superficial than long-lasting. One can already see some NATO members, most recently Hungary and Slovakia, but others as well, who are deeply opposed to the inclusion of Ukraine in NATO and understand the Russian security perspective and are restive within the confines of NATO as it currently exists. So I suspect when this war ends, however it ends, NATO will change, and that the US role in it is likely to diminish rather than increase. And that is emphatically the case if Mr. Trump wins the 2024 elections, since he has no affection for NATO and no understanding of its collective security mechanisms at all. You're muted.
You described NATO's move out of area as a search for a reason to exist, to maintain the U.S. military superiority and sustain the military-industrial complex. This included the many wars in Serbia, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, and more. This now includes Asia, but we'll get to that in a minute. The main issue now is the danger of a full-scale war with Russia. With the loss of the counteroffensive in Ukraine, it is increasingly recognized that the Ukraine war with Russia is lost, and even the U.S. Congress is finally recognizing that the American people will not support a continuation of the massive funding of this meat grinder war in Ukraine. Your thoughts?
Well, I think the fact is that indeed Russia is winning this war. Russia had two objectives. One was to ensure that NATO never incorporated Ukraine, and that is now very much impossible. So as the Vilnius NATO summit demonstrated, and as Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, has said, to incorporate Ukraine in NATO would mean to have a direct war with Russia. And that's not on the table. Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, has said that for Ukraine to join NATO would require a peace treaty between Ukraine and Russia. There's no such thing in prospect. Russia has essentially accomplished some of its objectives. First, the effective sidelining of Ukraine as a future member of NATO, and second, of course, the protection of Russian speakers in Ukraine, in this case by annexing portions of the Donbass and the Ukrainian southeast. So, yes, I think the war has produced a lot of dead Ukrainians, a fewer dead Russians, but a lot of dead people, and it has accomplished nothing beyond that from a Western point of view.
You also said quite clearly that you quoted Biden actually saying that Biden's open admission of the purpose for the Ukraine war was to, quote, sap Russia's economic strength and weaken its military for years to come. So there's no hiding the fact that this is a surrogate war against Russia. You also quoted Boris Johnson's intervention to prevent Zelensky from carrying out his agreement, which had been essentially made with Russia back in March of 2022, which would have ended the war based on autonomy for the Donbass. You didn't mention in that speech the threat of an escalation to a nuclear war. Why not?
Because Russia's winning. The only circumstance in which Russia would initiate a nuclear exchange would be if it were losing decisively, and this threatened the integrity of the Russian Federation. Vladimir Putin has been very explicit on this subject. The only danger of a nuclear war, therefore, is a Russian loss, which is not what is happening. And I would note that the pattern this war has taken is that Russia has counter-escalated in response to Western escalation. We keep saying, well, to the Ukrainians, well, you can't have this weapon system or that one, and then we provide it. And the Russians announce that they will counter that with an escalation of their own. So there's no record of Russia initiating escalations. So I just don't think this is a very realistic possibility. Of course, it's conceivable that as we lose, we will find some way to use nuclear weapons, but I think that would be insane. And it would be even beyond anything I can imagine in terms of American politics or policy. You're muted.
Popular support against such a thing would prevent it from happening.
The military, among others, would regard that as madness. Popular support would not be there either. And of course, whichever side initiates a nuclear exchange will receive nuclear attacks from the other. So nothing is gained. And the notion that was attributed to Ronald Reagan that a nuclear war can never be won and should never be fought is very much in evidence here.
Right.
So the question for me, as I said at the outset, is not the danger of a nuclear exchange. It is how to restore peace to Europe. This is the question the Russians raised repeatedly between 1994 and 2020 December, when they proposed it and a negotiation of a security architecture for Europe that would reassure all concerned, including themselves. We rebuffed that offer of negotiations. And the consequence was the Russian attack on Ukraine. They felt seriously enough about this issue and the threat to themselves that they were prepared to go to war. We knew that. And so the basic question that they posed, how do you construct a security architecture for Europe that prevents the peace, the outbreak of war, remains the operative question, and it's not being discussed at all in the West.
Right. Well, that's what I was going to bring up. I think you know that there are four prominent Germans, which included General Harold Kuyat and Dr. Horst Teltschik, who have proposed a negotiated peace plan for the war with Russia, arguing that it's either that they begin negotiations now or it's going to escalate. And they point out that if it escalates, you are dealing with the danger of possible global nuclear war. So this proposal is being broadly considered around the world. Your thoughts on that?
I note that President Biden at the UN General Assembly repudiated any negotiation on the grounds that it would, quote, reward Russia. But wars are not decided at the negotiating table. They're decided on the battlefield. There will be a negotiation sooner or later. And the terms that Ukraine will have to accept are not improving. They're deteriorating. Russia may well take additional territory, if only to trade it for a peace in a negotiation. Ukraine could lose its access to the Black Sea. That is not an impossibility, although it's militarily very difficult for the Russians to achieve. Ukraine's bargaining position has been progressively weakened by this war, not strengthened. almost nobody in the West is talking about Ukrainians and how to protect them or give them peace or bring them to prosperity and clean government and democracy. All these issues are set aside in favor of punitive actions against Russia. But there will be a negotiation, and the outlines of what could be done if the Russians were wise, which they're not incapable of being, are that the areas that Russia has illegally annexed in Ukraine might be recognized as independent of Ukraine for a period of a couple of decades, let's say, following which there would be an OSCE supervised referendum in each of these territories, asking them whether they wish to retain their independence, rejoin Ukraine, or rejoin Russia. That would be a democratic process that respected the will of the people on the ground. Nobody ever asks what the people of Crimea want. Nobody ever asks what the people of Donbass wanted. Why not ask? Anyway,
you don't think
that would provide an interim buffer between Ukraine and Russia in the form of independent polities and set up a competition between Ukraine and Russia to attract them. Now, this may be, in the case of Ukraine, impossible. It may be impossible to attract the Russian speakers, given the fact that the Ukrainian government now is committed to preventing the use of any minority language, even one as extensively spoken as Russian, for official purposes or for education. That was the first thing that the Ukrainian government we helped install in 2014 did, ban use of minority languages. This is something that is guaranteed in the OSCE Charter to people in Europe. It was guaranteed in the previous Ukrainian constitution. If it can't be reinstated, then I don't think Ukraine's ever going to see peace with its Russian speakers.
It sounds like you're dismissing the referendums in Donbass and in Crimea as illegitimate or something. What's your thought on that? I mean, why don't you recognize those as a voice of the people?
I think they were probably an accurate reflection of popular opinion, but procedurally they were illegal. Putting these under international auspices would give them a legitimacy they currently lack. I mean, the question is, there is an interesting contrast, of course, between the referendum that the Russians organized in Crimea, which I think accurately reflected the opinion of most people in Crimea, and accomplished a peaceful, bloodless integration of Crimea into the Russian Federation, and the NATO detachment of Kosovo from Serbia, which required a long bombing campaign and a lot of bloodshed. You can't have it both ways. You can't say on the one hand that conducting a referendum in Crimea that is improper when you've basically done exactly the same thing but more violently in Kosovo. So I think we need to return to some sort of sense of due process, legitimate process. And the way for that to happen is for Europeans to ensure that they supervise and guarantee the fairness of whatever referendum ensues. Of course, at this point, the Russians hold those areas and they're not going to give them up. I don't think they're going to go back to Ukraine. Nobody's talking about I should say nobody. Yes, of course, some people are talking about the need for peace negotiations, but officially, both Moscow and Washington seem to be committed to the further destruction of Ukraine.
Right. You've also argued that Russia has been significantly damaged by the launching of the special military operation, as seen in their economic and human costs. But you acknowledge that they were forced by NATO expansion to take action, or at least it's legitimate to argue that. And if we look at the results globally, and you note as well that we see a totally changed global geometry, with the BRICS nations now unified against the war policies and against the sanctions policies of the Anglo-Americans and NATO, while essentially the entire global South is openly joining, or at least cooperating with the BRICS and with the Belt and Road, and breaking from the U.S. dollar hegemony over world trade. So, I mean, in that light, isn't Russia and the world generally heading in a potentially far better direction as a result?
Well, Russia in many ways has been strengthened by this war. Its military production has increased dramatically. It has learned how to counter NATO's weaponry and develop tactics for doing so. It has seen a reorientation of its economy toward China, India, Middle East, and Africa that has actually enabled it to outpace Germany in terms of economic growth. And Germany, of course, is being deindustrialized due to the absence of competitive pricing for energy, having lost Russian gas supplies. There's now quite an argument between the French and Germans over energy. The French are heavily nuclear in their power generation and have much more competitive industrial base. So the Russians have certainly gained a fair amount from this. It's clear that the United States has been weakened, as you suggest. We have set in motion antagonisms to our hegemony that are growing. So far, there's more talk than action, but this is the writing on the wall. I think we haven't gained any great credibility anywhere. And now, of course, the war in Ukraine appears to be going in favor of the Russians rather than in favor of us. But Russia did lose a lot. It lost its connections to Europe, which are going to be very difficult to restore. It lost a good deal of its intelligentsia, who fled the draft. This is something that happens periodically whenever Russia goes to war. Many Americans of Russian descent are here because they fled the draft in World War I. The Russians have seen their relationships with Japan and others deteriorate, so they clearly paid a price. The regime in Moscow is more repressive than it was. It's an elected autocracy, but more autocratic now than it was. Many Russians don't like that. So there have been gains for Russia, there have been losses. But I think from the point of view of the United States, the losses far outweigh the gains.
As far as the coming together of the rest of the world, most of the rest of the world against this, do you think it's too late to try to convince the Europeans and the Americans to get into this new geometry? And will U.S. and Europe even survive if they fail to do so?
Well, I think you can look at the division of the world that the United States is engineering, not just through sanctions on Russia and Iran and North Korea or China, but through active decoupling, somewhat euphemistically described as de-risking internationally. You can look at this as isolating Russia or China, whatever, or you can look at it as self-isolation by the United States. And in many respects, the G7, which the U.S. Leads and which is the club of former imperialist powers, does appear to be retreating into its own stockade. And as it does so, it appears to be abandoning much of the democratic system that made it admirable in previous days. So I suspect that Europe, one way or the other after the war, especially if it is able to compose some sort of peace with Russia and Ukraine, and that Europe will indeed remain integrated, straddling both the American sphere and the Chinese sphere that is emerging. I'm not so sure about the United States. We have terrible domestic problems now, which we're not addressing. And we're behaving internationally as though we were omnipotent when clearly we're not. So we're taking many risks. I know in particular that we've launched a technology war with China, which happens to have over a fourth of the world's scientists, technologists, engineers, and mathematicians, and is increasingly innovative and creative at a time when our innovation is slowing down. And our economy is dominated by oligopolies that cooperate with the government. It's really almost fascist, corporatist, if you will, in the way things work. Try to put an unpopular opinion on the internet, and you will be blocked by corporate media in collusion with the U.S. government. This is not what the First Amendment was intended to guarantee. So I think the net effect of changes in the world, our reactions to them are causing our own values to be deeply eroded in ways that I think are gravely damaging to our republic.
I certainly agree with you on that. So let's switch to Asia. You mentioned that the isolation, the decoupling, or whatever from China is continuing. They're also continuing. The U.S. is also continuing its military buildup around China with the AUKUS agreement, and then the Japan, South Korea, U.S. military deal, expanding military cooperation with the Philippines, and so forth. And yet the Biden administration has recently deployed 3 cabinet members to China who are talking about, quote, improving relations. What's the real story?
Well, we want to improve relations so we can continue to isolate China. And it's hardly a surprise that the Chinese don't find this a very attractive proposition. So we have a tendency to ask the Chinese to cooperate on things that we think are important, while refusing to cooperate with them on things that they want us to cooperate on. And you can't have a relationship that works this way. I know Senator Schumer is in China at the moment, ironically, given the Opium War, which occurred a while back, talking about American addictions and imploring the Chinese to stop the supply of fentanyl, which they don't actually sell to the U.S. They provide the precursors to the Mexican drug cartels. It's not the Chinese government anyway, it's Chinese business people. And the Mexicans then make a pile of money off the world's largest drug market, which is the United States. Now, there's a lot of historical evidence that the only way to deal effectively with a narcotics problem is to address it at the demand level. We managed to get people to find smoking unacceptable, but we don't seem to be able to apply that knowledge to marijuana, cocaine, crack cocaine, fentanyl, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. amphetamines and whatnot. And we're not doing anything on the demand side. It's all about suppressing supply. Well, I can tell you from experience dealing with the narcotics issue in Southeast Asia, where I was the coordinator for our effort in the region, based in Bangkok, that the markup from the farmhead for a piece of opium to the streets of New York is 300-fold. That is, you will make, $30,000 times as much money selling that in New York as you will, and maybe my math is off, but I think that's correct, as you can if you're a farmer in Burma, Myanmar. Now, if that kind of markup exists, there's no way in God's earth that you're going to stop the market economy from meeting the demand. So you have to reduce the demand. There's no effort being made to do that. Now we have the Republicans talking about bombing Mexico to stop fentanyl production, as though that's going to solve a problem. It's not. We have a tendency to blame the Chinese for all sorts of problems that are frankly caused by ourselves, for ourselves. And then we wonder why they don't find this an attractive proposition.
Not only is there no effort to stop demand, but in fact, there's a massive move to legalize and expand the use of drugs quite openly.
Of course. So as I say, this is ironic, given the Opium Wars, where we insisted to the Chinese government at the time that we and the British and others had the absolute right to sell narcotics to the Chinese people, and that was improper for them to interfere. And we actually went to war on that proposition. And I note that in 1949, when the Communist Party of China took over, they addressed this problem by basically detaining the 10 million drug addicts and arresting and either condemning to death or imprisoning the pushers. This solved the problem. There's a parallel experience in American history after the Civil War. A great number of soldiers were addicted to morphine. And of course, to feed their habit, they engaged in criminal activity, burglaries and the like, robbery. And similarly, the federal government rounded them all up and made them go cold turkey, which was pretty nasty. Many of them died, but it solved the problem. Now, maybe there are answers to this that are less draconian than those used by the Chinese in 1949 or the United States in the 1870s, but no effort is being made to find those.
So, on the positive side, we have the 10th anniversary of the Belt and Road, which is coming up next week. There'll be another conference in China with people from all over the world joining. And of course, this goes along with the expansion of the BRICS after their conference in South Africa, which is now going to, assuming this goes through on January, this will include most of the world's, or at least much of the world's oil supply, which makes BRICS the central development process worldwide. What are your expectations for this process?
Well, I think the Belt and Road Initiative has grown and changed as it went along. The Chinese began this program, which is essentially an extension of China's industrial policies domestically to the global level, initially directed at Central Asia, but now global. Essentially, the Chinese authorized their policy banks to conduct due diligence on and lend money to projects that are originated by their business people, whether they're from state-owned enterprises or the private sector, and foreign counterparts. No project is proposed except in cooperation with a foreign partner. No lending takes place without due diligence. Now, the Chinese have learned a great deal about how to conduct due diligence, and their loan policies are now much more prudent than they were initially. But the transformational effect of this program has been immense in terms of increasing the efficiency of trade, not just physically through the construction of infrastructure, but procedurally as well, because a great part of the Belt and Road Initiative involves the conclusion of agreements for expedited customs clearance, bonded storage, transit without fees, and so forth, as well as industrial parks, and of course fiber optic cable and other airports, port improvements, all of which greatly increase the efficiency of trade and enable its expansion. So I think the program has been a great success, although at the moment less money is flowing into it than before for several reasons. Global trade is down. The Chinese economy is not growing as fast as it once did, and money is a little short. Of course, U.S. efforts to obstruct the Belt and Road Initiative have had some effect. Not a great deal, because the United States essentially offers rhetoric and no money for competing projects. And it is actually a fallacy to assume that if the United States builds a road or a railroad, that somehow detracts from a Chinese road or railroad. Anybody can drive down a road, anybody can ship goods on a railroad. Increasing connectivity benefits everyone, it doesn't hurt anyone. Arguably, doing that increases American or Chinese influence with the governments that benefit from the increased development of infrastructure. But I don't see any governments anywhere kowtowing either to the Chinese or increasingly to the United States. And a final note here, going back to the original question you asked about Israel's war on Gaza and Hamas's attack on Israel, you can forget the American proposed trade route from Mumbai in India to across Saudi Arabia to the port of Haifa in Israel. Not going to happen, never was going to happen, very likely, because of two factors. First, the political obstacles. Second, the absence of any American money or European money in this. But now it is certainly not going to happen, given the flaring up again of the immiseration of the Palestinians and the political reactions to that in the Arab Gulf.
Right. Okay, as you might know, Professor Jeffrey Sachs has been in China for the last few weeks. He gave a speech at the Temple of Confucius in Shandong. He spoke to diplomats at the UN office in Beijing. He describes the Belt and Road as pretty much the way you just did, as really the greatest development program in the world, and emphasizes that this is the proper model for development of Africa and the rest of the developing sector, but especially Africa, and encourages the U.S. and the Europeans to join it, to build the road. You just said that the U.S. doesn't seem to want to build. Why don't they? Why won't the U.S. and Europe join in this development process?
Well, this is part of the basic antagonism the United States has developed to China as a result of China's overtaking the United States in purchasing power parity terms, at least, as the largest economy on the planet. Chinese industrial production is now twice that of the United States. and China is the world's largest trader. What China is not is a power projector. It does not have the hundreds of military bases scattered around the world that the United States does. Doesn't have any particular desire to pursue an American-style hegemonic role of the sort we began after World War II, and in fact explicitly denies any intention to do that. But the United States feels a rivalry which has become essentially enmity to Chinese development. We are trying to hold back Chinese development, retard it, inhibit it, prevent China's scientific and technological advance, and deny it foreign markets for its goods and services. This really began earlier in the Obama administration with the failure to join the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and the effort to prevent others from doing so. An effort which I would note has entirely failed. That's the first reason we won't join this. And second is we don't have any money. We have to borrow $1.5 trillion just to keep our government going at the current level of operations. We won't tax ourselves to pay for things we need domestically, and foreign aid, foreign assistance, which means lending for purposes of foreign development, which is a sound thing to do because it increases overseas markets, it raises prosperity and generates prosperity for Americans. We won't do this, in part because we don't have the money, we don't have the revenue. The direction, we just saw a near shutdown of the U.S. government over this issue of whether we would pay as we go or not. In a sense, we just don't have the money. I would say, by the way, that the money now, where the money is, recalling Willie Sutton's reason for robbing banks, that's where the money is China and the Arab Gulf countries. These are great sources of capital for two different reasons. One, in the case of the Chinese, a very high domestic savings rate. In the case of the Gulf Arabs, profits from hydrocarbon sales.
Right. So, as I'm sure you know, Xi Jinping co-sponsored a China-Africa forum as part of the BRICS summit in Johannesburg, co-sponsored with South African President Ramaphosa, with at least many, if not most, of the African leaders attending. And the BRI was a major focus of that discussion. And then, of course, China had already organized the historic reconciliation between the Saudis and Iran. As the former ambassador to Saudi Arabia, what is your view of that agreement and its impact on the Middle East and on history generally?
Well, I note that agreement began with mediation by Iraq and Oman, which led to the opportunity that the Chinese seized to achieve closure in the negotiations between Riyadh and Tehran. It was a very positive development demanded by the countries of the region, as the role of Iraq and Oman illustrates. And it was an alternative to the American policy of unremitting hostility to Iran and maximum pressure on Iran. It was also an alternative to the effort by the United States and Israel to organize an anti-Iranian coalition in the region. And so while it is of enormous benefit to the parties, that is to say, normal relations with Iran, reduce the threat to Saudi Arabia from Iran, normal relations with Saudi Arabia, bypass the American embargoes, and provide Iran with a significant source of trade and capital. It was also a weakening of the American position in the Middle East, and a repudiation of U.S. policy, to which the United States has not reacted in any particular way. In fact, as tensions in the Persian Gulf diminished, we increased our deployments to the region. And now, of course, we've increased deployments again, this time in response to the Palestinian uprising. So it is a very significant agreement. China's diplomacy proved to be adroit, and it is an illustration of the merits of maintaining dialogue, diplomatic dialogue with all parties, whether you agree with them or not. And it is in that sense a direct counter to our behavior at the outset of the Ukraine war, when we refused to conduct a dialogue with the Russians on the issues that they said concerned them so much they might go to war. There is a parallel, I'm sorry to say, in the case of the Taiwan issue, where we will not talk about the issues of concern to the Chinese, but merely double down on military deterrence. Military deterrence depends on increasing the threat to China. Increasing the threat to China leads to an arms race with it, and far from reducing the danger of war, it increases it, because it leaves the Chinese with no path to achieving their objectives other than the use of force. But we don't seem to understand how to do diplomacy these days, and we don't have a lot of situational awareness, as shown in the idiotic remark of Jake Sullivan a week ago, that things had never been quite so calm in the Middle East, which was a tribute to the magnificent policies of the Biden administration. So I think events have caught him out. But sadly, this isn't the only instance. We're totally ignoring the fact that maximum pressure on North Korea has succeeded only in producing nuclear-armed ICBMs that can hit it anywhere in the United States. So we have created a nuclear threat that didn't exist. And we may be doing the same with Iran.
Let me continue your bringing up of the Taiwan question. There's going to be an election in Taiwan. I believe it's early next year. And I'd be very interested in seeing what you think that might lead to. Is there any possibility, in your view, that this could lead to a change in the policy towards the mainland to bring about some sort of reconciliation, if not reunification?
Well, the leading candidate is Lai Ching-te, who is the Democratic Progressive Party, DPP, and he is a staunch advocate of independence. The National Day in Taiwan, which is tomorrow, October 10th, Double 10 as it's called, which has always celebrated the Republic of China, which is the official name of the state that is not recognized anymore internationally in Taiwan. And that has been replaced with a celebration of Taiwan, to the extent that the Kuomintang former president, Ma Ying-jeou, has declined to join the National Day festivities. The trends are toward confrontation, not accommodation. This is extremely dangerous because China now has the capability to take Taiwan by force, even over U.S. opposition, of course, at huge cost. But as we've just seen with the Hamas attack on Israel, sometimes the fact that huge costs will be incurred is not an effective deterrent to military action. The question of how to end the civil war in a way that reaffirms some form of one China is a matter of passionate concern to Chinese nationalists. And China is very nationalistic at the moment. So I don't see the prospect as promising at all. The other three candidates actually in the race, don't have much of an answer either to how to restore cross-strait dialogue and rapprochement.
Is there a chance for one of them winning?
At the moment, the chances are poor. And in fact, there are too many candidates in the field. This is very much to the benefit of Mr. Lai. And the cause of the independence-minded secessionists in Taiwan.
Right. Okay, back to the Saudi issue. There's now a lot of discussion about the idea that Saudi Arabia either has or at least is considering canceling its very large $70 billion nuclear energy deal with the U.S. and signing a similar deal with China. I don't know if this is accurate, but it's at least being discussed. On the U.S. side, the U.S. has, as usual, conditionalities. They're saying that we'll have these we'll help you with your nuclear power, but you have to agree not to process any enriched uranium because we don't trust you not to build a bomb, and therefore you can't do it at all. And that you have to trade with China in dollars rather than the current effort to move towards trading in local currencies in the yuan. And other conditionalities that the U.S. intends to add to this deal. So it looks like that's falling apart. And of course, they were, at least up until this war broke out, the Israeli war, they were trying to arrange a deal between the Saudis and Israel. But that's probably on hold with what's happening now. One of the Saudi demands was that the Israelis do something significant with the Palestinians, quite the opposite of what they're doing. So China, of course, in their proposal has no conditionalities. They don't use conditionalities. So where does this nuclear discussion stand?
Well, there has been no deal. Talking about a $70 billion deal is interesting. But there are several factors that have to be borne in mind. The conditionality is one of them, because it is in addition to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, Saudi Arabia would have the right to reprocess. Saudi Arabia said that if Iran gets a nuclear weapon, they will too. So a nuclear fuel cycle that forecloses their matching Iran under circumstances where the U.S. is doing everything conceivable, as is Israel, to give Iran an excuse to develop a nuclear weapon, it just isn't very attractive. Saudi Arabia has been trying to get whatever it can from Mr. Biden's passion for a normalization with Israel, which of course is not a foreign policy objective. It's a domestic political objective aimed at generating campaign donations. The Democratic Party, 50% of the Democratic Party's donations that it receives are from Jewish Americans, although Jews in the United States are only 2.4% of the population. And many of that 2.4% don't give a fig about Israel. You do have donors for whom Israel and support for Zionism are transcendent issues. And Mr. Biden is appealing to them. I never thought this nuclear deal was likely to go anywhere. It's not just China that is prepared to provide nuclear reactors to the Saudis. So are the French. So are the South Koreans. So are the Russians. So the U.S., if it wants to be the nuclear provider to Saudi Arabia, has very limited bargaining leverage. And I would say more broadly that I think the way the Saudis have treated this issue of normalization with Israel has been to play it for all they could get, just to see what they could get out of it. And Saudi Arabia has always been, in recent years, quite prepared to engage in transactions with Israel. It would like, for example, to have Israeli tourists bring their money to Saudi Arabia, to the new resorts being built on the Red Sea. That makes a lot of sense. Hence, the Israeli Ministry of Tourism was permitted to travel to Riyadh recently. So the Saudis will do what they see as in their interest, and they won't do anything they don't see as in their interest. And provoking internal dissent and uprising, possibly, over the Palestinian issue in the kingdom is not in the interest of Mohammed bin Father the King. So I never thought that this normalization across the board was feasible. And as you said, given the Israeli savagery against Gaza in retaliation for the Hamas attack, it's even less feasible now than it was.
Right. There's another Middle East deal that's in the works that has been signed, which is between China and Iran, in which the Chinese are going to be, I think, rebuilding the major airport in Iran in exchange for oil imports. So this is not actually a barter deal, but it's something like what Lyndon LaRouche promoted in his 2000 article called Trade Without Currency, where you have a basket of commodities and you base trade on some sort of a basket of commodities, which would include gold and oil and things of that sort. This is something that Glaziev and the Russians and now all the BRICS are very seriously working on, that kind of a deal. And this China-Iran deal sort of tends in that direction. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, there are many precedents for this kind of thing in the region. The one that comes to mind immediately is the so-called Al Yamama deal between Saudi Arabia and the United Kingdom, which, of course, led to a great deal of corruption and embarrassment eventually.
And wars.
Well, it was, however, the commitment of a supply of oil to Royal Dutch Shell and British Petroleum. The proceeds from the sale of that oil were then banked at the Bank of England to fund in an account managed by British Aerospace. So this is an arrangement that's very similar to what seems to have been done between the Chinese and Iran. That is, the Chinese construction company would get paid from the proceeds of sales of Iranian oil, which presumably will then be banked in a Chinese bank. Which one, I don't know. Maybe just the People's Bank of China, which is the central bank. This is an interesting development, but it is hardly unprecedented. And it is perhaps a model for other transactions involving commodities.
Do you have thoughts on this financial deal that I just referenced? The fact that the Russians and the Chinese, and now really the whole BRICS and much of the global South, are actively negotiating ways of setting up alternative systems that are independent of the dollar. And that partially includes local currencies, but it also is discussion of a new system altogether. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think about 20 years ago, I remember having a conversation with a noted American pundit who writes for the Washington Post, in which I said that the abuse of the dollar as American currency, but also the universal medium of trade settlement, would lead eventually to ways, a search for ways to dethrone the dollar from that trade settlement role. And that is exactly what is happening. The cause of this is the widespread use of American financial sanctions, the denial of access to SWIFT, the clearinghouse in Brussels for dollar-based and euro-based transactions, the use of the dollar to interfere with trade between third parties, which has no connection to the United States, except that the trade settlement goes through the Federal Reserve in New York. These practices are widely seen internationally as hegemonic abuses of American power, and they're unacceptable. And so I think it's hardly surprising that there's quite an effort being made to find ways around U.S. use of the dollar to control other countries' foreign policies and economic interactions. At the moment, with a few exceptions, one of which is Sino-Russian trade, this hasn't gone very far, but it is increasing. And oddly enough, the euro has been diminishing as an instrument of trade settlement as the yuan and other currencies increase. I don't understand why that is the case, except perhaps that the European economies have been gravely damaged by the war in Ukraine, or more accurately, by the sanctions imposed on Russian energy exports as a result of the war in Ukraine. We keep saying, well, the war in Ukraine caused this. Well, we had choices about how we responded, and we chose to respond in several ways, including probably blowing up the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which is an act of war against an ally, Germany. And I think the European economies are paying the price for this in terms of future expectations of their viability. So maybe that explains why the euro is going down rather than up in terms of usage for trade settlement. You're on mute.
Thank you again. All right. All right. That's very good. Is there anything you'd like to sort of say as a concluding remarks?
No, I've incriminated myself enough, I think.
All right. This is very useful, and I appreciate
you can cut and paste and edit and all that and make sense of it, maybe.
No, I don't think I'll have to change a word. Yeah, this will be very, very important. I appreciate your taking the time to do this. It's a busy time in the world, that's for sure. This is an incredible moment of crisis in civilization. Helga characterizes this as the end of the era of colonialism, the 600 years of colonialism as the sort of structure of the organization of the world, which is coming to an end. And what direction it's going to go, it could go either well or ill, but it's going to change. There's no keeping this system any longer.
I agree with her about that. 5 centuries of EuroAtlantic hegemony have come to an end. The United States, as the heir of European colonialism and Japanese colonialism, is also seeing its empire fray at the edges. The events in the Holy Land are one indication of that, a violent indication. The war in Ukraine is another. And of course, you have discussed the emergence of alternative institutions like the BRICS. One could also mention the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the new development bank under the BRICS, and the wide expansion of freedom of maneuver for middle-ranked powers like the Saudis, who now have choices before them that are no longer constrained by fealty to the United States. See this with Turkey as well. So I think she's correct. This is a Zeitenwende, as somebody said.
Oh, what?
Zeitenwende,
Zeitenwende?
yeah, a turning point in history.
Yeah.
Pivotal moment.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.